So to start, um, this is a talk that was originally envisioned as part of a tarot workshop we were going to do at the Durham Theosophical Society. So when I talk about divination here, if I stray into things a little bit more tarot than dowsing, forgive me a bit there. So let's start out with a little bit of what do I mean when I'm using the term divination. Really what it comes down to is this idea of getting information from beyond. You know, literally, of course, it means information from the divine. But we use it for any sort of term where you're really getting information from a source other than just the traditional knowledge data stuff that we're used to on a day-to-day basis. So this, of course, includes dowsing. And also we use divination and, of course, different sorts of fortune telling, you know, Ouija boards, tarot cards, even then also some of the intuitive arts, intuitive when it comes into just plain doing trance-like readings or getting information intuitively from astrology into, you know, reading tea leaves, any of this sort of thing. When one sits back in a sense of prayer or contemplation or meditation, it's almost a form of divination when answers come from beyond you, the sort of spiritual guidance or spiritual communication. And then lastly, divination includes, in my mind, the act of theurgy, where one is actually trying to communicate with the spirits or with the gods in some form of worship. So it's a big umbrella of thing, all really working at information that comes from outside our normal self. So what I hope to do in this talk is to look at some of the ideas and the explanations around what's really happening behind divination, behind getting this sort of communication. And to help me kind of paraphrase and provide a sense of guidance with, you know, and also help me organize a bit of, you know, what are these different types of divination? I've come up with this sort of graph of gradients of experience. And it's a little bit of my, I guess, my scientific background coming in here. So when we talk about these, as we go through our slides, you'll see this little graph here, kind of with an idea of looking at how we would explain divination from one extreme, as we're trying to explain what happens when we're dowsing, to our most, you know, objective, orientated, our hardcore science, hardcore atheistic friends, you know, really from looking at it from an objective, verifiable point of view, or how we might explain what happens in divination from a more subjective, softer side. You know, the sort of how we might talk about divination to our kind of our fluffy unicorn friends, you know, who are sometimes out there in woo-woo land. And of course, there's all sorts of gradients in between. So this is kind of help me kind of scope things out and organize the thoughts. So let's start out with, of course, one explanation of what is divination, or one answer, is really almost the answer of there is no divination, there is no divine happening. What happens when a person gives, for example, an accurate dowsing measurement, they're able to find find the water or find that buried electrical field, or someone gives an actual, accurate tarot card reading, what's really happening is that the reader is completely sensing different sort of unconscious, but really still human clues. So, for example, if I was giving this talk in person where I could see everybody, I would be able to judge if you were really interested in what I was saying, or if your mind was elsewhere. I could tell maybe if I wasn't getting through, maybe it's my accent, or if I have to slow down or speed up, or whether any sort of jokes or pathetic attempts at humor was working. But giving this a talk in Zoom, I don't get any of those sort of clues from you that I can respond. In the same way, when one is giving a reading like person to person, like for example, when you're reading tea leaves or something, there's a little bit of clues of whether you're going on the right track or not. There was a time I actually had some stands in psychic fairs, and I was doing astrology there. And everybody who comes to you could almost, there was only about three main topics that most people want to know about. Most people want to know about their relationship. So, armed with, so unless you're dealing with Capricorns, it's usually about the relationship. And with Capricorns, it's usually about the job. But this sort of, you could immediately, as you started asking a couple questions, as one was looking up the details, you could see if you're on the right track or not. And those subtle clues kind of start shaping where the reading is going. Now, from a materialistic point of view, we could almost say the same thing about dowsing. That when we're right, going on, picking up energy, that there may be something physically there, maybe something physically is responding to the wands or our senses, or maybe just within the human body itself, we're sensitive to different sort of magnetic or different sort of electrical charges. Maybe there's a sensitivity to water, humidity, that we're generally not aware of. We can be sensitive to smells that go through their unconscious. A friend of mine was telling me about a story, the article he read about how elephants can sense via their feet. They can sense water, miles and miles in the distance, simply because of that sort of sensitivity. There's been other experiments done with humans on migratory, where we know of our place. So in times, maybe some sort of innate instinctual knowledge that we're not aware of. So one of the explanations for divination is that this really is nothing more specialist than that of the mentalist, the detective, who responds to a variety of other clues out there. And it's just really a hyper, intellectual being. Now, if we just take a step away from the physical and think about the psychological aspects, maybe what's happening in divination is all about the consciousness. So I put up this model of the psychologist Carl Jung dealt with this in many ways. To be brief, of course, we're all kind of aware that in psychology, we talk about having a personal consciousness and a subconsciousness, which is that we're not aware of. That's been programmed into us by ways of behavior. In the same way, there's a collective consciousness and a collective unconscious. Yeah. On the news too much in recent months, we've seen a lot of really discussion about what's happening in collective consciousness, both aware of and not aware of. The idea of the mass mentality. People who study consciousness, especially group consciousness. And there was a study going on in Harvard where they were actually measuring what they thought was collective consciousness of the world. And anyway, from there they could see there would be just these random upticks before there was some sort of major effect affecting a lot of people. So there's this humanness that's going on. So there may be in collective humanity as a whole a sense of collective unconscious. Now, this relates to divination. That as individuals, we kind of can pipe into that collective unconsciousness and maybe pull from it. So this also the idea, explains some of the ideas of like spontaneous technology, of how different innovations can spontaneously pull up all over the place. So, and why maybe artists come up with similar sort of ideas, similar sort of songs around the same time. That people are really just responding to that collective level, responding to that underground stream of consciousness that runs through everything. Another idea of what's happening, of how divination works, is that divination is a natural response. That we are all creatures of the earth. And there is a sort of pantheism that we're part of, that we live in Gaia. We live in this large ecosystem where, again, we're responding to things in a natural level. And divination is really a bit of picking up those sorts of vibrations from our own collectiveness. And there's this wonderful quote I came across. It says, natural philosophers believe that by contemplating the natural world, this could lead to a type of mystical experience where the soul expands beyond the limit of the self and comprehends the whole reality at once. And I think this is a beautiful way of thinking about how, from a pantheistic viewpoint, this sort of allowing ourselves to kind of settle in to the background nature that's around us almost starts giving us clues as far as what's happening maybe with the person we're trying to read, or what's happening in the scenario to try to detect the energies around us, or what's happening when we're trying to focus and understand really what's going on in the thoughts of or to feel a friend or a relative or a lover who's distanced, and to pipe into that. And it's our natural connection to the earth, that we are all earth stuff, as Aborigines like to say. And So we share the same molecular structure of everything else here on the planet and of each other, and that this actual physical connectiveness explains why we can link up into seemingly a divine aspect, but really that this is nothing more than just being a natural being on this planet and getting to our natural, physical, authentic self. Another idea around what happens with divination and how the world is connected is the idea of ethers. So ether is a term that explains the idea of space. Some people, Vedic use the term akasha, but it's what fills up space. And that this sort of element, because it really was seen as an element, both in the Vedic system and also kind of pre-19th century, people were talking a lot about how magnetism works, how animal magnetism, things such as mesmerism was going through the ethers. So the earth itself had an etheric body as a Gaia sort of living being. And there's connectiveness to people and things all through this etheric web. And this ethericness kind of explains sympathetic magic and explains how we are partly all connected. And of course, individuals all have etheric bodies, etheric energy fields as well. Now, I think often in theosophy, we talk about there being, number of 5 different, sometimes 7 different etheric subtle bodies around us. And it's through these subtle bodies that we really experience what's happening in the world. So we have our basic energy that comes through the chakras, it goes out through the nadis, but also that these sort of subtle energies around the human body kind of work like a little bit of it's kind of the reverse of force field, but it's kind of like a little sensory barrier that starts going out and kind of touching in at those around us. Some groups, I know the Flower of Life people, they talk about the aura going out as far as like 15 feet, would be about 5 meters, around a person. That, if you want to push out your aura field, but of course, there's ways to pull it back in, but if it's beaming out, it's that much. So of course, even with social distancing, people are coming into our auric field, auric space. Sometimes we even talk about people not kind of recognizing personal space. That we'll talk about a rude person just being in your face, just, or we might be uncomfortable when someone we don't know or someone we don't like just stands a bit too close to us. So part of this is our ether, our etheric bodies, our subtle bodies coming in contact with someone else. Now, how this relates to divination is that many groups, such as certainly in Theosophy or in the writings of Alice Bailey, they talk about a certain amount of memory being stored in the etheric body. And that actually, when a soul incarnates, it's the etheric body becomes first and gradually fills out the physical body, and then later to make a place for the soul to come in. So there's a bit of a memory in some of the subtle bodies that can be picked up by another person's subtle bodies, or so the theory goes, if you're within a close distance to each other. So this sensing through the ethers happens because of our own etheric body coming in contact with other people's etheric body. And while that's divination, of course, this is the idea behind radionics. So in radionics, I'm sure these Dowsers, you're probably familiar with this. Radionics or any sort of psionic work. The idea is that most radionics practitioners I've met anyway, believe that the communication that happens from the radionics operator and the witness who is being treated, that this happens via the subtle connections of in the etheric fields. That the witness, either the picture of the person or something physical, provides the link, and that there is a sympathetic thing that happens. So as the witness itself is dosed with the energy created by the radionics machinery, that in turn helps the person who's actually connected to that witness, and that happens via the ethers. Now, one of the things I've always been interested in about, like, with the idea of, like, how does, radionics work? And this is kind of course, one of those things, if you've ever been on any of these sort of Facebook social media groups with radionics, the question comes up, how much of how radionics work, how much of it is the actual physical thing of what's happening with radionics and with the radionics machinery and the witness, or what is the role of intent? What is the role of the operator? Does the state of mind of the operator, does that have an effect on what happens, on how effective the witness is? Is it important that the operator be mentally clear, physically clear, purified when they're doing a radionics work? And and when people ask these questions, the answers come all across the board. There'll be some radionics practitioners say, no, it doesn't matter. You just put them on the machine because it all works through the ether. It all works through the energy that's being focused, from whether you're using a card or you're using some sort of homeopathic essence here. So it's all that it doesn't matter at all. And then there'll be other individuals say, no, the intent of the operator, the direction of the operator, the motive of the operator really affects how much, how well the radionics treatment works. And in fact, I've actually been in discussions where radionics people will say, well, in fact, it's so much about will and intent that you don't need a machine at all. Well, if you don't need a machine at all, You know, are you doing radionics or are you doing some sort of, you're doing some sort of other magic or prayer even? So, when, radionics starts pushing that boundary, as far as operating that toward, towards some of the thinking about consciousness and the magical side of, divination. So when we think about, thinking about, kind of the operator, that extended thing that you don't need the machine, that it is all about intent, or it's about prayer. It's about pushing out divine energy. Then we're starting to get into the area of really working with higher, different levels of consciousness. So talking about levels of consciousness, it's kind of a nebulous area in itself. We can talk about, people like to use the term higher mind. Well, what is that? Is this higher mind, is it just simply maybe my superconscious, something where I've stored all this information in the back of my brain and I don't even know what it is? Or are there levels of consciousness within each of us? And this kind of gets to the area, something when we were talking about the subtle bodies, that there may be levels of consciousness that expand and go out with the individual. So while I may be aware of what's happening on a day-to-day basis, there may be another part of me, the observer, as some of the metaphysical systems talk about, who's a bit more, evolved than my conscious mind, actually looking down and measuring at what's going, and looking down and seeing everything from a standpoint divorce from emotions, divorce from kind of the prejudices that an individual may have, that there's a higher level of oneself that's actually seeing maybe a clearer view of what is really happening on the day-to-day basis. And, or, so that this higher self, I think Patanjali would call it, whether we're at the soul or the Atman level, but this higher self actually, having a clearer picture can bring information down. It's as if, during those times, or when you are able to step back and have a clear vision of what's going on, that this higher self is always at this level of observing. So because they have a higher view, they're able to give information to us when we sit in divination, or when we're really opening ourselves up for some sort of intuition and divine. Now, if we have these higher levels of consciousness, these higher selves, and consciousness is fluid, does my higher consciousness maybe talk with your higher consciousness? So if I'm trying to do a reading for you, maybe there's cross communication going between, on this consciousness to consciousness level, beyond what we're actually, physically aware of. So, thoughts come to us. One example of this that I often experience is when I wake up in the morning, sometimes not all the time, occasionally, when I wake up in the morning, I will know the answer to my problems I was trying to solve the previous day, especially when it deals with work, Or sometimes I just wake up in the morning with this idea that I should do or start a new project or do a project. And if I follow that, it's, 9 times out of 10, it's unusually successful. So there's this sort of intuition that comes in, after the sleep stage. So we have these different levels, if we have these different levels of consciousness, and it's certainly something that I think about, that I believe, then that actually kind of can guide and appear like, divine wisdom to instruct us when we're working and trying to read others and trying to get at the core information. So we're thinking about the higher mind, higher consciousness. Do we have all of that information in our own self? Or is there also a pool of knowledge that we can go to? Is there does a higher mind have access to special shared information? Now, Rudolf Steiner and Blavatsky would talk about the Hall of Records. I think the Rosicrucians talk about the Hall of Records as well. So, and Casey used the term, others used the term Akashic records. That there is actually this pool of information somewhere in the ethers, again, where we've got this word Akasha with ethers, that there's information out there in the ethers that one can actually access on a conscious or an unconscious level. The mystic Edgar Casey would go into trance. And when he was in trance, he could be asked questions. And he was often pulling from the Akashic records, that he was able to go there and kind of read what had happened in the past. And some of the writings, like the theosophical writings, let it open that if we're there, we can also get a more clear view into what's happening now. We can read the current state of things by what's happening now to understand ourselves. And others, such as, I believe Nostradamus, he talked about being able to kind of go into the future and actually get information and read what was happening at that point. That it was a bit of a visionary sort of aspect, but it was that this information was already out there and that one can go up and expect this.
The for the stock exchange?
What?
Sorry.
Okay. So now when we talk about going into like the Akashic fields or the etherics, when, are we also talking about soul awareness and soul knowledge? So if there is a soul, and I believe there's a soul, if we have souls, and I also believe in reincarnation, which makes it handy then to talk about, can I access my soul memory? My soul memory to see both into the past and also to read the contracts I've come into in this current life. Can I interact with my soul or get information from my soul to really see what were the karmic things I wanted to accomplish in this life? Where does my destiny hold? And maybe, when I'm working with someone else trying to do a reading, can I then, by contacting my own soul, also get an idea of contacting their soul? So that maybe I can help them understand what's going on by initiating the soul communication and the soul awareness. In past life regression sessions, people talk, past life regressors talk about this idea of soul contract, and they talk about this in-between life scenario. So in a past life regression, a person goes to the time that they had died in the previous life, and then does a review of what was happening and what did you really want to accomplish. And the same sort of regressive technique is used to go into and try to access soul information, to look at the current life and to look at, okay, really what was part of maybe the soul contract with a difficult person, or maybe what are some of the qualities or some of the talents that I've brought down that really need to be unlocked within me to achieve my higher purpose. And those things that I can, the ways I can best use this incarnation. So I think in these terms, this idea of that we have using the soul memory and soul awareness is a way that looks a lot like some sort of, some sort of divination or divine. Of course, up to now we've been talking about elements and kind of theories that who we're talking about in divination is really part of our own self. But there are many people, when they talk about what is the source behind divination, they'll talk about using guides. Now, these may be personal guides, spirit guides. Some people use ancestral guides, power animals, and such. But the guide is kind of an entity, wisdom outside of ourselves. So in shamanic work, and one can use, the regular shamanic work, we usually see a lot of shamanic work being associated with healing. But there's also shamanic practices where people go to, for example, capture power or soul, and try to get to understand what are maybe the problems in this life. So the shaman may go and contact a spirit animal, and that spirit animal then may be able to disclose what is happening. Some people, when I wish I should have looked up the name. I've watched some dowsing videos on YouTube where some dowsers also use their guides. One gentleman was, he even had the name of his guide who was there, and he would talk and communicate with him to help him do his dowsing. I know people who are tarot readers, before they do a reading, will sit back and then see themselves connecting with their guide, so that these information is coming from the outside. Now, the guide, of course, one hopes that they somehow have gotten more information and that they're truthful, but I guess that would be a different sort of spirit, and they wouldn't be a good guide if they didn't really understand what's going on or know what's going on. But that's another point. They should know what's going on. So the guides are there and are contacted to help take us through and take us along. Another form is actually working with the ancestral work. And there was, I know this is done in a lot in some of the, Latin American groups, but that one really kind of calls upon an ancestor to help out with the divination. And sometimes this can be just, kind of a simple thing of seeing yourself talking to this, to an ancestor who might be known, or they might be unknown, who's gone beyond. And again, has access either through the spirit world to see what's happening, or just simply from a different perspective to give guidance. I know I have a little card game that I use for divination. It's actually kind of a kid's card game about baseball, baseball cards, and you can draw a card and there might be a home run. You could draw a card and there's a strike, etc. But it was a card game that I used to play with my grandfather. And after my grandmother died and we were clearing out the estate, I found this deck of cards. So I use it, and whenever I use it, I talk to my grandfather. I kind of see him. He would have been horrified if I talked about this with him in regular life. He is a very stoic sort of person, but whenever I do this, I use these cards for divination. I actually do a little prayer, and I approach it as if I'm working with my grandpa on these cards. And they're very handy because, sometimes if you do a reading, like a tarot reading, things are not cut and dry. And you just want to know if it's yes or no. And the cards work well for that. Yeah, I suppose I could dose, but this won't. But it's good to talk to Grandpa sometimes about these things. Another source for information about divination and the intuition of what's going on is really the devas, or the spirits of a place. I was at a workshop once a while ago with Mayan shaman, with Humboldt's men, and Humboldt would talk about that if one wants to know about what's happened in a place, it's best to talk to the trees, because the trees have a record of everything that's gone on in that location, and they pass it on to their, to their offspring, to the seeds that come out of there, and they communicate through the roots to each other. So literally by putting your hands and head on the tree, one can, and asking the tree for information, they can provide guidance and provide a look of what is happening there. Often when we go into a place, and I'm sure, I'm sure you guys have all experienced this. You go into a place and you can sense the certain energy there. And if you sit down and you open yourself up, sometimes it's as if the local angels or spirits of that place are talking with you. So this is also a sense of, but it's different than when we're talking about higher forms of consciousness, because we're talking about beings that are external to ourselves, coming and giving us this special knowledge. Whoops. Sorry. Let me back up here. Of course, another kind of another step from devas, or spirits of places, tree spirits and such, the idea of angels and divas, and really, we could even say the divine itself. I know pagan friends will actually call on different deities for divination. I've got friends who read Ifa, which is a Yoruban divination system. And there, of course, there's special deities that one calls upon before one does the reading. This even includes aspects around prayer. That, whether you're talking to God, some sort of Christian Judaic God, or you're talking about other sort of, pagan gods or divination, that they can come and bring information. In Vedic astrology, the god Ganesh will come, and he's often, people give an offering to him, a little prayer before going into the reading itself as a form of guidance. Some people believe that there are special angels or systems or other entities that actually can participate in providing information and guidance. And this kind of gets into the whole idea of saints and people who do saint practice and saint worship. That these sorts of entities are there to be able to communicate with man and to bring up and to give us guidance and give us illumination. And of course, they're a source of wisdom. Now, how much, we could get all psychological on this, I suppose, too, and say that, okay, if you're praying to St. Jude to find some sort of article, you're really praying to an aspect of yourself, who maybe unconsciously knows where that lost article is, because there's part of your brain that actually remembered where you put it, even though you're not consciously aware, or whether or not you believe that there is this external force that knows these things. And it's part of, kind of one of those mysteries. So I think we could think about it internally or externally. But the deities are also a way to help with this, or another way of thinking about it. And sometimes I think there's a benefit in thinking about the source of information coming from something higher than yourself or external. I suppose it's good when you're doing a reading and it turns out very negative. It's good to have, I suppose, some sort of saint or Orisha to blame. Okay. And then, of course, whether it's inside or outside of ourselves, when we're talking about where does that divination come from, maybe the answer is sort of in the sort of mystical pantheism, is that it doesn't matter, because there really is no outside me or an inside me, that everything is just all one. That when we're talking about who's talking in divination, the problem is there's not a them, there is just an us, there is just oneness. That the separation between our consciousness, between the energy coming off other things, is just an illusion. That it really is all just one. And there's this wonderful quote that I think from Plotinus that explains this. And he says, the secret is, firstly, that this all is one universally comprehensive living being. encircling all beings within it, and having a soul, one soul, that extends to all of its members, and in the degree that the participant membership held by each. And then secondly, that every separate thing is an integral part of this all by belonging to the total material fabric, an unrestricted part by bodily membership. And well, insomuch as it has some participation in the all. They're all just one big thing. And who's talking? That would be, we're just talking. So, thank you.
Thank you.